God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God alone I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?
Hey, hello everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And over here on my left or right or whatever that is, is my co-star, if you please.
There you go.
There you go. Preterist Apologetics, my great friend Mike Sullivan. And I tell you what, folks, want to thank everyone for your wonderful comments about our study of the Song of Moses. I would say this to a lot of people. If you can't get excited about studying the Song of Moses, there's just something wrong.
Yeah.
You know, you need a blowtorch to get you started and set that fire. It's just such an amazing, amazing text.
You know,
And,
I think most Christians don't even know it's there.
oh, no question.
But
Mike,
when you find it,
yeah, Mike, when I was growing up in the amillennial world, I had no clue Deuteronomy 32 existed except numerically. You know, there's Deuteronomy 28 to 30. I probably knew a little more about Deuteronomy 38 or 28 to 30, certainly than I did about 31 and 32, because every once in a while a preacher would refer to the law of blessings and cursings. But never in my upbringing did I hear a single sermon, never read a single article, never read anything that would suggest that Deuteronomy 32 existed as a prophecy of the last days. Just wasn't on the map.
You know, when I gave this presentation at the conference, I had to stop at one point and say, you know, I was so frustrated reading the commentators. I mean, John Lightfoot has got some good stuff. Adam Clark, yes. But for the most part, Don, none of the commentators, and I read a lot of commentators, do not like, you know, the perverse and crooked generation.
Oh, yeah.
Or when the appointed time comes, the end would be near. They don't connect all that to how the New Testament authors say that that generation is their generation, therefore the end was near. They just don't, and it's like it's left up to us to make this basic connection.
Well, it's like I was pointing out to you in the book that I recommended, that J. Ross Wagner, Heralds of the Good News. That book is almost encyclopedic in its treatment of Deuteronomy 32. And by that, I don't mean he's got that much on it, but what he does have is so wonderfully exciting, and it's so invigorating, and it's so challenging, because he draws out all of these analogies from the song and shows where Paul is in fact using the song as the outline for his entire gospel narrative. And as I've mentioned, N.T. Wright says that the Song of Moses is this tremendously important chapter of the Old Testament. He doesn't go into it near like J. Ross Wagner does. And Richard Hayes mentions it some, but it's like you said, it's so frustrating to read the scholarly literature. And the very first time, I mentioned this on an earlier program, the very first scholarly article that I ever read, and I cannot find that article again. I've done searches for it, but it's by a scholar by the named David Mosner, Moessner, if I remember correctly. And it's entitled Sons of God, if I remember correctly. I remember reading that article and just, you know, the mind just exploded with the richness of the connections that he was making. And yet, to go back to what you were saying, it really is exasperating. And you're just like me, you got commentators here and there and everywhere, and you can pick them up and you just do not see that exegetical development. And you're going, how did you miss this?
Yeah.
Why did you miss this? Is this and Beale, of course, we both love to quote G.K. Beale. We love his writings in many, many ways. It blows my mind. We come to Revelation chapter 19, 1 and 2, in which now has come salvation and the kingdom, power and glory. For you, O Lord, have avenged the blood of your martyrs. And he says, well, that's a citation from Psalm 78. Okay, that's fine. But where does Psalm 78 get it from? And he simply says, it's possible that he's quoting from Deuteronomy 32:43. And you're going, what do you mean possible? All throughout your massive book, and the New Testament use of the Old Testament, commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Boy, you go into great detail about how this New Testament passage quotes that Old Testament passage and how wonderfully it interrelates and enlightens Paul's theology. And yet here, the Song of Moses, in one of the most climactic statements of the book of Revelation, and you just kind of gloss it over by saying, it's possible, but it's really Psalm 78, as if Psalm 78 is unrelated
Right.
to Deuteronomy 32.
And like we said, everything builds upon Deuteronomy 32. So yeah, Psalm 78, but where's he getting it? He, like you said, he's getting it from Moses. Got to go back to the original source there.
Exactly. Now, before we get into Daniel chapter 9 and the Song of Moses tonight, it's been recommended that we make a few comments. What about Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium, in which God made the promise that the seed of woman would crush the head of the serpent would bruise his heel? Is that not related to the Song of Moses? So that's the question that's been posed. You offer a few comments, and then I'll do a few comments as well.
Oh, Genesis 3:15. Well, I think of Romans 16:20. Satan would be crushed shortly under the feet of the Romans. So and you look in your cross references, folks, it goes right back to Genesis 3:15. And then Revelation, you have all the time text that's connected to Revelation 20:5-15. Now, those are the only verses that Doug Wilson and, Ken Gentry don't want to concede were fulfilled in AD 70. But again, you have Satan being judged again. Now, no matter how you understand Satan, it's clearly a reference back to Genesis 3:15. So that's one aspect of it. And then you have, the promise of overcoming the death, because Satan would bite his heel, but Christ would crush him. And in crushing him, what is he going to do? He's going to defeat the sin, the death, and the law, as Paul will develop it. And then in Revelation, you have, Revelation 21, where you have the New Jerusalem coming down, and it's in the New Jerusalem that the death is no more. Mm-hmm. So once you come through the gates of the city, through faith, you are raised, you are glorified, you are in union with Christ's body, and you are face to face with him, and the curse of the death is gone. Those are the two main ones that I can see. You can pick up some of the other ones if you want, but
no, I think those are great points, and they're absolutely valid. I think the question was directed more, maybe I misunderstood the question. I hope I'm framing it correctly. But okay, if Genesis chapter 3:15 there is part of that, well, it is the proto-evangelium. It's the initial promise of Messiah, the initial promise of salvation. How does that correlate with Deuteronomy chapter 32? Well, I think it's a simple explanation. We've stated this many, many times, and that is the problem of the garden is carried through into the story of Moses and Israel. That's what Romans chapter 5 develops. Yeah. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. Okay, Moses did not solve the problem of death. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is the promise of the overcoming of the problem of the death, but it's the death that reigned from Adam until Moses. So Moses enters, and Moses gives us the song. So while While in Deuteronomy chapter 32, we do not have, so far as I'm aware, I cannot remember one off the top of my head. And as you know, after I read the question, it's a good question, by the way. After I read the question, I got to thinking, okay, is there a specific verse in Deuteronomy 32 that we could tie to Genesis chapter 3 in regard to the death and Satan and what have you? About
Absolutely.
all I could say to that is that God in Deuteronomy 32 begins to set forth Israel as the enemy, as the adversary. She will become like Sodom. And that's what I mean by that. She will become as the vine of Gomorrah. So when you have the serpent, the enemy, bringing death, and you come to the Song of Moses, and you have Israel becoming like Sodom, like Gomorrah in the last days, then that's saying nothing more and nothing less than Israel becomes the enemy of God
Yeah.
and fulfills that role and is to be destroyed in the last days.
Yeah. And, Moses is writing Genesis. I mean, traditionally, the first 5 books are referring to Moses. So Moses is writing this, if he did. We have the promise of the Messiah coming through a woman, through her seed, which is an odd way of saying that. Usually it comes through the man seed.
Yeah.
Some have said this might be a reference to the virgin birth. That's a little tough, but some have gone there. But then, he's going to talk about Abraham's seed, right? And Galatians, Paul tells us that that's a promise to Abraham and to Messiah, seed singular. And thus, when we're united to him, we are Abraham's offspring as well. And then you have Deuteronomy 18. Moses prophesies of one greater than him, a prophet. There were plenty of Jews that saw that as messianic.
Oh, yeah.
And then once we get into the blessing of Jacob, all right, you have another promise of this Messiah, the seed of the woman, Genesis 3:15. It begins to get clear. He's going to come from Judah, but he's also going to come from Joseph's line. And then you have the metaphors of a shepherd rock. You have the metaphor of a vine that extends over the wall. So he's not just going to be blessing Israel; he's going to be blessing the Gentiles. That's what that's inferring. So you do have this slow development between Genesis 3:15 into the Song of Moses, and then we have in the next chapter 33:16 and 17 this ox that, according to the Levitical code, would be sacrificed, but he becomes a conquering ox as well, which implies the resurrection and the transformation. We were talking about Enoch off air, and Enoch references that. And he says that ox made all the other animals white, pure white, like that ox. And I'm thinking, wow, that's the imputed righteousness of Christ after he has suffered, been sacrificed, and is now transformed into this mighty, powerful ox. And it's white, and it turns all the other animals into a white ox to be conformed to his image. Yeah. So, Enoch it picks up on that as well.
Enoch's a fascinating book. I don't agree that it, with some that claim it needs to be in the canon, but it is nonetheless a really, really fascinating book. And I've been doing more study in Enoch over the last year and a half than I ever have in my life, to be honest about it. And there are some tidbits in there. And I've shared an anecdote from one of the first debates I had on full preterism, in which I pressed my Church of Christ opponent, who, keep in mind, in the Church of Christ, God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the Old Testament at the cross. And I pointed out that in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter said his doctrine of the day of the Lord was from the Old Testament prophets. So I challenged my opponent, give me an Old Testament verse that predicts the day of the Lord, the end of time, burning up the creation, as you believe it is taught. He ignored me. He ignored me. Time after time after time, I kept pressing him. I said, according to the rules, you're supposed to answer my question. And so finally, he said, the book of Enoch. Well, in the first place, that has him saying that Enoch is in the Old Testament, which is really problematic for a member of the Churches of Christ.
Right.
And secondly, and of course I had set the trap, I pointed out, had a chart with the quote, Enoch said that the final judgment, when all men would be judged, the final judgment would be in the seventh generation from Adam, which just kind of coincidentally happens to be the first century generation, the generation of which Jesus said, there's some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, which is the judgment. And the guy's face just went white. I mean, it was one of those Kodak moments, I can tell you that. Yeah. And it was one of those moments when a shock literally went through the audience. They could see how he had just blown himself completely out of the water. So anyway, all of that as an aside, the point of it is that here, Genesis chapter 3 is not an isolated prophecy of eschatology. It is, and we've said repeatedly how the Song of Moses is the foundation. Well, in one sense, clearly it's built upon the original promise of Genesis chapter 3:15, because he's talking about the ultimate day, the last days, the day of salvation, the time of the avenging of the martyrs, pardon me, the calling of the Gentiles, and on and on and on, with all of the soteriological tenets that are found in Deuteronomy chapter 32. So when Mike and I have said, well, Deuteronomy 32 is the foundation of New Testament eschatology, we're not trying to exclude Genesis chapter 3, but by any calculation, Deuteronomy 32 is far more comprehensive, and it is building upon Genesis. So that's why we're spending more time on it.
Amen. Somehow we're streaming on YouTube as well, and I'm not sure how, but all right. Well, if you're on YouTube and you're joining us, great.
I might have done that. I don't know.
Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad.
Okay. We want to discuss tonight, folks. Now, last week we dealt with the Song of Moses and Daniel chapter 7. And let me just hit a highlight or two of the difficulties this presents for any traditional view of futurism. Daniel chapter 7 is delimited to the Fourth Empire, the days of the Roman Empire. While dispensationalists and some future amillennialists seem to be buying into it, there's supposed to be a yet future man of sin, great tribulation, restoration of Israel, destruction of Israel before the establishment of the kingdom. We're still looking for a great tribulation. Well, that's real problematic, because in Daniel chapter 7, it's in the days of the Roman Empire, not a revived Roman Empire, but in the days of the Roman Empire that the little horn arises. The little horn not only arises, but he persecutes the saints, wears them out until the coming of the Son of Man as the Ancient of Days. In judgment, he destroys the little horn in the Fourth Empire. Exactly. Now, if you're going to have a revived Roman Empire, then guess what, ladies and gentlemen? You've got to have a revived man of sin.
Absolutely.
It just doesn't work. So Daniel 7 is so definitive in its time parameters and limitations. You can't go to Daniel chapter 7 and just arbitrarily say, well, I know he's talking about the days of Rome, but we're still looking for the universal coming of the Lord. Remember? Right. Before we came on the program, Mike was sharing some thoughts with me from the pulpit commentary. They're just comments that blow your mind from a highly recognized commentary set. And W.D. Spence, I think that's Spence is the last name, who just openly says the second coming of Christ occurred at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But then, to avoid his entrapment, what was his exact words there, Mike?
Well, let me back up.
Yeah.
That's in verse. This is from 1 Corinthians 1:20. All right, and he's talking about the end of the age there, as referring to the Old Covenant age. And he correctly talks about the two ages, right? The Old Covenant, this age, and the age to come was the Messianic age, the New Covenant age. So he was right on there. And then he just admits that Christ's second appearing, second coming, was fulfilled in AD 70 in the fall of Jerusalem. And that was his coming. So I was like, okay, well, what does he do with verses 7 and 8 of 1 Corinthians 1? Because it talks about the charismata being given to the church, and confirming the church to the end. And I'm like, well, surely he's going to connect that. And he says, well, the early church of the first century believed that the second coming of Christ was going to take place in their generation. Then he says, and it's basically valid because Jesus taught he was going to come in their generation. And I'm like, okay. And he's taking us right down the road here. And then he says, Matthew 24 was fulfilled. So, okay, their expectation of the second coming was because Jesus taught it, and it was fulfilled in AD 70. Therefore, I don't understand why all of these New Testament passages he lists were not also fulfilled in AD 70. Even 1 Corinthians 15:23, the parousia there, and thus the resurrection. But like you say, at the very end, he says, but we await a more universal fulfillment of these promises. But he doesn't give a text because he surrendered all of those texts already to AD 70, and he told you that the second coming. So where's your coming for this universal fulfillment? It's all gone. So I think he saw the ramifications of what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And to get into the pulpit commentary, you got to toe the line. So he's like, I think other people will maybe figure this out.
Yeah.
And we have.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's just another example. And you can go back. I just realized that I had moved and lost a bunch of stuff. I hope I didn't lose this. I had found a microfiche from University of Arizona. I looked it up years and years and years ago because I kept running onto references to this one particular scholar who every single verse that he expounded on wound up fulfilled in AD 70.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going, I got to find this dude. So I did, got the microfiche, went to the library, got on the reader. Sure enough, and I wanted to know what he said on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, of course. Every single verse in 1 Corinthians 15 was without any doubt whatsoever fulfilled at the end of the Old Covenant age in AD 70. And then in footnotes, he was like, now this doesn't mean that we're not still looking for a physical resurrection. But just like Spence, he would never give a text for that.
Yeah.
He even said the same on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Very clearly, Paul expected this in his lifetime or in that generation. That doesn't mean we're not looking for something else.
Right.
And so you find that in an awful lot of 18th and 19th century scholars. I mean, it's in many, many of those older commentators. F.W. Farrar, I love reading F.W. Farrar.
Yeah.
Fantastic scholar. He says a lot of that stuff like that and leads you right down to the water trough and says, don't you dare drink of that. You know?
Right. Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
Well, before we get into the 70 weeks, you basically have the same issue. You have guys like Kyle and Dalich that will read this and say, well, these 6 events occur at the second coming of Christ and the world of righteousness and the new creation, right?
Yep.
So they kind of spiritualize, I guess, the 490 years and make it, just some prophetic time or something. But that's correct. This is when all prophecy would be fulfilled. They're right. And it's connected to the second coming. But then you'll have other church fathers and commentators say, well, the 70 weeks were either fulfilled, around AD 35 or AD 70.
Yep.
And we come along and say, yeah, you're both right. We hold to both orthodox views of Kyle and Dalich. clearly refers to the second coming of Christ, but we honor what the New Testament says and it connects it to AD 70. So,
yeah. And it's amazing how many of the early church writers saw AD 70 as the fulfillment of Daniel 9.
mhm.
I mean, a lot of them did. Now, early writers such as Hippolytus was one of the very first to put a gap between the 69th and the 70th.
Mm.
But nonetheless, an awful lot of the early church writers, pardon me, and in my book, 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection, I chronicle an awful lot of quotes from early church writers who said, fulfilled in AD 70, without a doubt. And it's just fascinating. Now then, what we do, I want to close back on Daniel chapter 7, okay? And we're running out of time real quick. But I think this is very important. Not only does Daniel chapter 7 limit the fulfillment of the man of sin and the coming of the Son of Man to the days of the Roman Empire, what that means is when we come to the New Testament and we see all of these New Testament uses in the Gospels, primarily, of the term Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, what should that tell us, ladies and gentlemen? Now, here's where scholarship really gets confused and confusing, to be honest about it. Scholars such as N.T. Wright says, well, Daniel 7, 13, and 14, without a doubt, is the ascension of Jesus Christ. It's Jesus going up. He's not coming down. He's not coming in judgment. And even one scholar that I read good long while back, I don't remember which one it was, said, well, Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is kind of a parenthetical insertion into the text. It's not related to the man of sin or the persecution of the saints or the judgment of the man of the sin. And you're going, what? Where do you get this idea of an insertion, of a parenthetical insertion? There's nothing in the text to justify that claim. So again, men like N.T. Wright say it is the ascension. Well, this gentleman, and he is a true gentleman, Elton Holland, he is a scholar with whom I am having a written exchange. I guess you could call it a debate. Super cordial, super collegial. I'm just having an absolute blast being involved in this discussion at such a high level.
If I'm not wrong, I think your presentation at the next conference in Arkansas is going to be a development of kind of what you're with between the tribulation and the resurrection, correct?
Absolutely. I will be speaking on the tribulation and the resurrection.
Well, that's going to be good, yeah.
So here we have Daniel 7 predicting the great tribulation. This is the man of sin. This is that little horn bringing persecution, I should say, at the same time as the great tribulation. So what does that mean? Okay, noted what N.T. Wright believes. However, Elton Holland does a fantastic job showing that reference of the thrones being set is a reference to judgment being set on earth.
When the books are opened,
And
the end of the millennium.
It's
and
exactly
Bill points out whether they're plural books or singular. He says, no, this is the same. This is directly coming from Daniel.
I think there's little question that it's coming from Daniel. I mean, you don't have all these multitudinous references to opening of the books. You have Daniel chapter 12, which is resurrection and the opening of the books, or those who are written in the book. So, well, we both know someone who tries to find about 1,412 different opening of the books, but we won't go into that.
Right.
But again, ladies and gentlemen, we have repeatedly in the New Testament all of these references to the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew chapter 10, 22 and 23. They will chase you from city to city, and you will not have gone, that is, fled, throughout all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man has come. And I'll just give a quote here.
And he who endures to the end will be saved. The end of what? This goes back to Daniel. Son of Man goes back to Daniel.
Right, exactly right. Great point. There's a scholar by the name of Andreas Stutz. In a really short, brief, concise article, he says, Jesus uses the term Son of Man some 26 times in the New Testament. Okay.
Favorite description for himself.
favorite description for himself. When Jesus uses the terminology of coming on the clouds, it is invariably a judgment coming.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means that preterists didn't wake up this argument. There are many scholars, and I've got a whole list of them in a work that I'm doing here, of scholars who recognize that Daniel chapter 7 and the promise of the coming of the Son of Man is not the ascension, it is Christ coming in judgment. So Jesus, over and over and over again, quotes from Daniel chapter 7, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, sitting at the right hand of the throne, etc., etc. Matthew 16, 27, 28, Matthew 26, 64. Every one of those, judgment context. But what do people do? Well, they go to Matthew 16, 27, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, etc., and reward every man. Oh, well, that's the end of time. Well, if it's the coming of the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7, it's in the days of Rome.
Right.
If it's the coming of Matthew chapter 24, verse 30 and 31, it's the coming of the Son of Man of Daniel 7 in the days of Rome. Matthew 26, 64. Every single use of the term coming, or the sentence coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, is a judgment coming, which is restricted to the first century and the days of Rome. Well, then you come to the book of Revelation, Revelation 14. I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And a shout was said, set forth the sickle and reap, for the earth is ripe. Here's the coming of the Son of Man. So when does it have to happen? Days of Rome.
Amen. Amen.
That's such an incredibly powerful reality. I am convinced that the great majority of people do not truly catch the power of that argument. They're just so used to looking off in the far distant future and literally divorcing the coming of the Son of Man from its prophetic temporal context. And that's a huge mistake. And remember, folks, this is Israel's last days. This is the judgment. This is the kingdom. This is Deuteronomy chapter 32.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that segues pretty well into Daniel chapter 9. So I spoke a good bit. Why don't you develop those connections for us just a little bit?
I'll back up real quick to Matthew 10. Matthew 10, Jesus says the kingdom of God or heaven is at hand. All right. Yep. Then he goes on and he talks about a judgment day that's coming. And then in verse 17, we have, there's going to be severe persecution resulting in some of their deaths. So you have the kingdom, you have the persecution, you have the coming of the Son of Man, and you have the end. That's all Daniel. Now remember, Don and I talked about Daniel 7, 15 to 27, where it's a recapitulation of Daniel 7, 9 through 13, because it's an explanation of that. And so that's when the saints inherit the kingdom and when all this severe persecution comes from. So Jesus is just developing Daniel 7 and 9, and then Daniel 12 is simply a recapitulation of Daniel 2, 7, and 9 as well. So, and real quick, on the Old Greek Septuagint, in your article that you have on your website, and I posted on mine as well, you pointed out that when the New Testament references an Old Testament passage, it's like 300 or 320 times or 300 something times that they're quoting from the Septuagint, whereas maybe 20 or 30 times it's a direct quote from the Hebrew. And so when we look at the Old Greek Septuagint of Daniel 7:13, it's one like the Son of Man comes on the clouds either as the Ancient of Days or like the Ancient of Days. And I like F.F. Bruce, and it cost me $30 to get the quote, and I have it. But when he goes to Revelation 1, 7 through 17, what do we have here? The one like the Son of Man comes upon the clouds, but when he's described as the Ancient of Days.
That's exactly right.
And F.F. Bruce says, well, he's obviously drawing from the Old Greek Septuagint. So yeah, clearly that's him coming in judgment. That's not the ascension we talked about last week. When Jesus is talking to the high priest and the council there, he uses the second person plural you, and he says, some of you among this high priestly council, you're gonna see me, okay, seated in next to the Father. That's Psalm 110. That's the ascension.
That's right.
Then he conflates Daniel 7:13, but you're going to see me come on the clouds to judge you. I'm the Son of Man. I'm the eternal God. So yeah, it's not the ascension. It's limited to the time of Rome, but it's not his ascension. It's clearly the second coming, and he's all
I
the
was I was in an internet debate on this very question about Daniel 7:13 and 14, whether it's the ascension or whether it's the judgment coming. And this particular individual was just absolutely adamant that Daniel 7:13 and 14 has to be the ascension. I said, well, then so I went over some of the things that you just went over, and that is, okay, Daniel 7:13 and 14. Before verse 13 and 14, you have the little horn arising, persecuting the saints. The judgment is set, and a fiery stream of judgment goes out from the thrones, and that's the judgment of the little horn. So I said, show me where any of that happened prior to the ascension.
right.
That was sort of kind of the end of that discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And in Matthew 10, when they say that's the ascension, the coming of the Son of Man there, well, where were they flogged in synagogues? When were they brought before Gentile kings? When were some of them put to death before the ascension?
That's right.
It does not work.
No. Okay, so we come to Daniel chapter 9, and John Walvoord said Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27 is the most important Old Testament prophecy of all. I'm not sure I would agree with that assessment, but without any doubt, it's one of the most important of all messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. Now, as I've pointed out before, when you come to the Jews of modern times, they will not allow that Daniel is even a prophet of God. I mean, no, we don't allow him to be a prophet. Which of course disagrees with the Dead Sea community, but that's a separate discussion.
Yeah.
But Daniel is being given this prophecy of the 70 weeks because he knows that according to Jeremiah chapter 29, 10 and following, the Lord had predicted that Israel, that Judah specifically, would be in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And he read the records and he knew that the time was up. By the way, Mike, if God can't tell time, how did he manage to tell 70 years? I wonder how that worked out.
Yeah.
I wonder why Daniel said, well, God said 70 years, but hey, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years as a day. I guess I'll just kick back, not worry about it. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. So anyway, he knows that the time for the 70 years is just about expired, so he prays. He acknowledges Judah's sin. He acknowledges God's righteousness in punishing them. Again, he confesses their sin. He asks for forgiveness, and he asks for the Lord to respond to him and to forgive. And so the angel is sent to him, Gabriel, I think, to say his prayer had been answered. But that Judah was not going back immediately. Now, a remnant did, as promised. No question about that. But Daniel was informed that there was a greater significance, a greater goal, a greater destiny attached to this 70 weeks period of time. And by the way, folks, that is couched in Jubilee terminology, in festal terminology. Yeah. In other words, Daniel was saying, Daniel, your people have been through a lot. They have suffered a lot. They're going to be brought back, but there's a grand and a glorious climax to their history. And that goes back to the Song of Moses. Here is the end. Here's the goal of Israel's history. And that's the 70 weeks of Daniel. Now, what's interesting to me is dispensationalists, better than almost anyone, recognize the centrality of the 70 weeks of Daniel to the eschatological scheme. Now, Do they insert a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 7th? Yes, unfortunately, they do. And they know that that's a tenuous doctrine. Thomas Ice says, and I have it in my files, and I've written about it before. Thomas Ice says, if there is not in the text of Daniel 9, verse 26, I think he places it, of so far 2,000 years, then dispensationalism falls to the ground.
So true.
So true. Boy, is it ever true. That's how important the gap theory is to dispensationalism. I made mention a few moments ago that Hippolytus, one of the early church writers, was one of the very earliest Christians to suggest that. He had the same misunderstanding regarding the nature of the kingdom and the nature of the parousia that Thomas Ice does. I'll just say it that way. He misunderstood the nature of the parousia, the nature of the kingdom.
Right.
Well, I could go on and on and on about that. But the point of fact is, Daniel chapter 9 lays out a panoramic view. There are 6 constituent elements. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city to put away sin, to make the atonement, to finish the transgression, to seal vision and prophecy, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to anoint the most holy. Folks, those 6 constituent elements, just like Deuteronomy chapter 32, involve the eschaton.
Absolutely.
The eschatological consummation. You know, Mike, I will never, ever, ever forget the day that I saw that Daniel 9 predicted the resurrection.
Yeah.
It was like, holy cow. Well, you know, it's another one of those occasions where I'm going, how have I been so ignorant? For crying out loud, Preston, you know. But it was also so exciting. And on that very day, I was actually at a friend's house in Oklahoma City waiting to go to the airport to catch a plane to fly to some seminar somewhere. I don't even know where it was. He and I had been talking about Scripture. And I'm just relaxing on the couch. And all of a sudden, this came through. To seal vision and prophecy. Wait a minute. That means to fulfill all prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
That includes the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Bring in everlasting righteousness. That's when the force of that particular term and phrase really hit me. That is 2 Peter 3. That is Revelation 21. That is resurrection epitomized.
You can't be in a new creation. You can't be in a world of righteousness without being raised.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
And
those are the thoughts.
And you can't have all the sin forgiven, right? Without resurrection.
That's right. I mean, that's exactly right. And I sat there and I I hollered out to him, I need a pen and paper. Quick, you know. And he goes, what? I said, never mind, just give me pencil and paper. And so I start scribbling. And you know me, I have a tendency to think syllogistically. And so I sat there just writing out one syllogism after another, just one syllogism after another. And he's going, what are you doing? And I said, no, leave me alone. And he thought that was so funny that I wouldn't even talk to him because you know how it goes. The thoughts start flowing and you just do not want to be interrupted.
Usually it's in the middle of the night. It's like
2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Yeah, the very first time, my wife and I had not been married very long, or I should say we hadn't been at our first ministerial position very long. And I'm laying there between sleep and consciousness, you know, and I was struggling with my eschatology. And man, the thoughts just came raging through. I jump up out of bed, turn the light on, looking for pencil and paper, and she goes, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And I'm going, you know, and she says, Don, what is wrong? And I said, shut up.
Oh boy.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Not a good thing to say. Ran into the next room, found the pencil and paper. Thankfully, I'd managed to salvage and to maintain the thoughts, wrote it all down, turned the lights out, came back, and I said, hey, babe, I'm really, really, really sorry.
Yeah.
I humbly apologize, but I explained to her what was going on. And so ever since then, if I just jump up in the middle of the night and head to the other room,
knows the deal. Whatever.
yeah, whatever.
Go do your thing.
Yeah. So that's what happened with me on Daniel 9, and 70 weeks are determined for the resurrection.
Yeah.
It is absolutely stunning. Now, folks, what does this have to do with the Song of Moses? Well, it has everything in the world to do with it, because as Mike and I have been showing, Daniel is about Israel's last days. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and on your holy city. Well, what's at the end of the 70 weeks? Abomination of desolation and the utter destruction of Jerusalem. And by the way, a new creation.
Yeah.
Song of Moses, oh, that they were wise. Oh, that they would consider their last end. And what would be their last end? Well, let's see. How can one put 100 to flight? How can 100 put 1,000 to flight, except their rock had forsaken them?
Right.
And I will provoke them to jealousy with that which is not a people, because they provoked me to jealousy with that which is not a God. This is a people of no understanding. I will turn my face from them. There's Israel's last days for you, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. And
so
we know that the rock is rejected in Deuteronomy 32. And then here we're told that the Messiah would be cut off, and that the Messiah would send, getting into the Septuagint again. And my dog is having a coughing spasm. He, using the Septuagint, he says that the Messiah, the prince, is going to be cut off, but he, after 3.5 years, towards the end of that 3.5 years, so we still have another 3.5 years that Daniel 12:7 will pick up recapitulation with the resurrection. But during that second 3.5 years, we have the end and the war that's coming. And Don, you were the one that picked up this. In the Septuagint, kairos is used.
Oh yeah.
Okay. And going back to Deuteronomy 32:35, Septuagint, kairos is used. The appointed time, not chronos. All right. This is a very specific time of fulfillment. And Moses says, when this perverse generation comes in the last days, your end, your final end will be near in the appointed time. And now Daniel is telling you the appointed time is connected to that last 3.5 years, which is the end. And then Revelation 11 talks about the 3.5 years. And it's when Rome trods down Jerusalem. That's the appointed time of the end. And it's the end of the Old Covenant age. And it goes no farther than that. And just like Daniel says, it all has to be in the time of the Roman Empire.
There is, you and I have said this before. And I well remember, as a young man in the amillennial world, being mystified by some of the narratives of Scripture not being able to connect those dots.
Yeah.
When I started seeing covenant eschatology, instead of trying to fit historical eschatology into these texts, all of a sudden the dots just started connecting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And such a symmetry and such a unity began to manifest itself. I have literally, and I've told you this before, and I've said this on air before, There have been so many times in which I would be reading and studying and researching the scriptures, and I would find these perfect connections between so many verses. I'd become so excited, I'd literally scoot myself across the room, or I would literally yell, stand up and pump my fist in excitement
Yeah.
because of the beauty and the unity that is there. And that's what happened when I began to see over the years that connection between Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12.
Yeah.
The connection is there. And yet you read scholarship. John Collins, who is without a doubt one of the most highly acclaimed academics in the world today, pardon me, a quote expert on the book of Daniel. Well, one of the reasons that we know that Daniel chapter 11 contains some true prophecy is because the writer stops recording things of the past and starts making future predictions. And the reason we know that he's making future predictions is because those prophecies failed. Yeah.
No presuppositions or bias there.
Oh, no bias there at all. So, according to John Collins, and he's not alone, ladies and gentlemen, according to John Collins, the way that we know someone was trying to make a genuine prophecy is when his prophecy failed. Now, how does that compare with Deuteronomy 18:18? Oh, he's only a prophet if his prophecies come true. And Collins comes along and says, no, he's only a prophet if his prophecies failed.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman kind of has the same
he has the same
Daniel.
philosophy.
Yeah.
Precisely the same philosophy. Okay, now, Mike's already shown to us from Deuteronomy chapter 32 to 36, at the appointed time, Israel's end would be at hand, coming soon and quickly. Well, in Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are determined. That word determined, that is translated as determined, is from the Hebrew word kitash, as I remember it. Probably did not even come close to pronouncing it correctly, but that's okay. Kitash means to be cut out, and thus determined. Well, the word kairos means divinely appointed, divinely determined, if you please. So we have kairos about Israel's end, and now we are finding 70 weeks are cut out for Israel's fate, for Israel's end. And folks, it doesn't. I spent years and years and years. I do not claim to be the definitive answer on Daniel 9. I still have really good questions about it. But I believe that Daniel 9 contains a definitive response to when the 70 weeks would end.
Oh, yeah.
We will get to that next week. But in the meantime, Mike, I want us to definitively, or at least a little bit definitively, examine those 6 constituent elements and to show how they were fulfilled in the first century. and they were not all fulfilled at the cross.
Yeah, you can't. There's no way you can do that.
And furthermore, they were not fulfilled by 34, 35 AD.
When the gospel went to the Gentiles.
When the gospel went to the Gentiles. That is the position held by Kenneth Gentry and a host of others. Joel McDermott once held that. I do not know what he holds now. But several postmillennialists and even some Reformed amillennial guys believe that the 70 weeks ended in 34, 35 AD. I don't think that works either. I think the only defensible position is the 70 weeks genuinely did end in AD 70. So let's begin with 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. Now I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, Mike.
Okay.
70 weeks are determined to put away sin. Jesus Christ appeared at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So there you have it. On the cross, Jesus sacrificed himself to put away sin. That's it. That's in the 70 weeks. Therefore, the 70 weeks ended at the cross.
Yeah, well, you have to understand the high priesthood of Christ, and that there is 2, it is finished in the New Testament. So you have the passion. He fulfilled all the promises concerning his passion. And so we have the already of Christ canceling our debt. That's what's nailed to the cross, not the old covenant law, but it's our debt. It's the sin through his cross, and he sprinkles the conscience. All right. But actually the sprinkling doesn't happen until the high priest goes in the temple. Then he comes out a second time, where the congregation is eagerly waiting to see if God didn't strike him dead, and therefore they can know when they see him that their sins had been atoned for another year. And so it is at his second coming that sin is completely atoned for. So that's how I would answer that.
You know, it's interesting. And just today, I've been in correspondence with one individual. They're actually a Sabbatarian. There's a bunch of Sabbatarians have been watching my videos on the feast days, trying to find for some justification for seventh-day Sabbath. It hasn't worked real well for them, but nonetheless, this individual chided me for the already but not yet. Well, Paul said we have redemption, even the forgiveness of our sin. I said, well, here's the problem. You're forgetting Ephesians 4:30. Notice what Paul said, in whom we have, present tense,
Already
redemption, even, this is exegetical, that's the big fancy word, meaning here's the definition of redemption: forgiveness of sin. Okay, done deal. Wait, let's just close the books and go home. You know, it's over, it's done. Well, wait a minute. Ephesians 1:12 and 13. After that you obeyed the word of the truth of the gospel, you were sealed with that Holy Spirit as the earnest of our inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession.
Right.
And then in Ephesians 4 verse 30, you were sealed with the Holy Spirit until the day of redemption. Now, wait a minute. Redemption equals forgiveness. The day of redemption was coming. So this individual was saying, oh, no, Paul was very clear. Redemption was real. It was already present. And I pointed out, then how do you explain Paul in Ephesians 4:30? He says the day of redemption was still coming. And I also wrote, I said, by the way, Paul also said that forgiveness, the taking away of Israel's sin, which is, by the way, Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, would occur at the parousia. So I just told this individual, if you're going to say that sin had already been objectively taken away, and I said, let me make this observation. They had been given the charismatic gifts as the earnest, the guarantee of the removal of their sin.
And I'm thinking about Romans 11:25 through 27.
That's exactly what I pointed out.
Zion, then, according to the new covenant connected to the second coming,
yes,
is when he would put away the sin.
Yeah. So we have these texts, as I pointed out, that yes, they sound like it's a present reality. Having their full boldness to enter into the most holy place. And that individual brought this passage up. They were already able to enter into the most holy place. Well, no man could enter in until forgiveness, but forgiveness comes at the day of the Lord. Sorry, this isn't already, but not yet. It's prolepsis is what it is. Speaking of things that are future as if they are present realities. And so what happens, especially in the futurist camp, people latch onto a singular passage which says what they want it to say. That's really what it amounts to. And they camp there, and they literally just brush aside, they ignore all of these other passages which are speaking of the same identical subject, but they place it at the parousia. Well, that's not good exegesis. That's an abuse of hermeneutic. I call that an atomistic approach to Scripture. You take a single atom, so to speak, a single verse, and you camp out there and you say, oh, that's it. That's the sum total. We've got to be holistic in our approach. and say, well, you take this and you take this and this and this and this, and you put it all together with a holistic approach, and you come out with a holistic view, a totality view that harmonizes all of these different passages. It doesn't set them at odds with one another. It harmonizes them all. And yet I had one guy last week, I was blown away. He said, I'm telling you right now, your problem, Preston, is you're trying to harmonize eschatology, and you cannot harmonize it. There is no harmony in the eschatological narrative. And I just wrote back and I said, well, in your world, there's no harmony. But in covenant eschatology, there is harmony.
Yeah.
So I invited him to join us.
Yeah, Michael Heiser had that approach where
Yes.
the New Testament just it's purposefully left vague. We cannot know, and this is allegedly God's plan, that we just can't know eschatology. It's just going to pan out, in the end. And Don and I do not see that, because from Moses to the New Testament, he gives us when that appointed time would be near. He tells us, and we just have to accept it. The problem is that we don't accept the nature of Christ's kingdom, the Daniel 2 kingdom that Jesus exposits when he says it's in you, it's within you, it's not of this world. And they just have to have that physical kingdom, unfortunately. Well, it looks like our time is up. I did want to apologize. My dog usually just sits over here quiet. She has had something in her throat. I don't know. Hopefully the mic didn't pick this up.
It did.
Okay. Well, hopefully there was a little humor, and some of you are amused by that. Hopefully it wasn't much of a distraction. But
well, we have pets, Mike. We understand.
There you go, man. There you go.
All right. Great show. Enjoyed it.
Yes, we will see you guys next week, and I guess we'll continue. Maybe we'll continue going through those 6
Oh,
things.
yeah. We have to. We absolutely have to.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
All right.
Good night.
Take care.
That I may walk before my God in the light, in the light, in the light of life, 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 in the